At 06:30 on June 6, 1944, Corporal Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. crouched in landing craft tank number 592 as it approached Omaha Beach through heavy surf, watching German 88mm shells explode in the water around his vessel, while carrying medical supplies for the only African-American combat unit in the D-Day invasion. 21 years old, 4 months of medical training, first combat mission. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion had trained for 8 months to deploy hydrogen-filled balloons over invasion beaches to prevent German aircraft from strafing American troops. Woodson was one of 5 medics assigned to land in the first wave at Omaha Beach with Battery A. The other 416 men of his battalion would follow in subsequent waves, carrying balloons, hydrogen cylinders, cables, and winches. Intelligence reports indicated minimal German resistance on the beaches. The reports were wrong. At 06:45, German artillery found landing craft tank 592. The first shell hit the portside bow. The explosion killed 3 Navy crewmen instantly. Metal fragments tore through flesh and bone. The second shell struck amidships. 5 more Navy personnel died. Blood mixed with seawater on the deck. The third shell detonated near the stern. Shrapnel tore through Woodson's left thigh and buttocks. Hot metal fragments buried themselves deep in muscle tissue. Blood soaked through his uniform trousers. He stayed conscious. The landing craft listed to starboard. Water poured through the damaged hull. The Navy coxswain tried to maintain course toward the beach, but the vessel was sinking. Of the 26 Navy personnel operating landing craft tank 592, 25 were dead or dying. Only the coxswain survived the artillery barrage. German machine gun fire raked the exposed deck. Bullets punched holes in equipment boxes and medical supply containers. Wooden crates splintered. Woodson pressed field dressings against his wounds to slow the bleeding. He could not stop to treat himself properly. The landing craft was going down. Men around him were screaming. Some had lost limbs. Others had abdominal wounds with intestines visible through torn uniforms. He grabbed his medical bag and prepared to evacuate. At 06:52, landing craft tank 592 struck a German teller mine buried in the sandbar 100 yards offshore. The explosion ripped the bottom out of the vessel. Steel plates buckled. The craft settled rapidly into 8 feet of water. Wounded soldiers and equipment spilled into the surf. German machine gun fire continued from pillboxes on the bluffs overlooking the beach. Woodson jumped into the water. The weight of his medical bag and soaked uniform pulled him down. He kicked toward the surface. Shrapnel wounds in his legs made swimming difficult. Pain shot through his thigh with each kick. He reached air and looked around. Bodies floated in the surf. Some men thrashed in the water, unable to swim with their equipment. Others lay face down in the waves, already dead. The beach ahead was a killing zone. German machine guns and concrete bunkers swept the sand with interlocking fields of fire. Every square foot of beach was covered by at least 2 machine gun positions. Mortars landed in clusters among the landing craft and soldiers struggling ashore. Artillery shells from positions inland exploded among the assault waves. Smoke from burning vehicles mixed with morning fog to create limited visibility. Woodson waded toward the beach. Each step required conscious effort. Pain from his wounds increased with movement. His left leg threatened to buckle with each stride. He forced himself to keep moving. Men were dying all around him. He was a medic. His job was to save them. At 0700, Woodson reached the beach and took cover behind a steel beach obstacle. German machine gun fire tore through the air 6 inches above his head. He assessed the situation. Wounded men lay scattered across 200 yards of beach between the waterline and the seawall. Some called for medics. Others lay silent. Medical aid stations had not been established. The assault was failing. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion mission was to deploy balloons to protect troops from air attack. But the Luftwaffe was not the problem. German artillery and machine guns were destroying the invasion force. Balloons could not help. Medics could. Woodson opened his medical bag. Morphine syrettes, sulfa powder packets, bandages, tourniquets, plasma bottles, scissors. The supplies were intact, despite the explosion and immersion in seawater. He began moving toward the nearest wounded soldier. The first casualty was a private from the 1st Infantry Division. Bullet wound through the right shoulder. Woodson cut away the uniform with scissors, applied sulfa powder to both wounds, wrapped pressure bandages, administered morphine, tagged the soldier's uniform with time and dosage. 3 minutes. German machine gun fire forced Woodson flat against the sand. He waited for a pause in the firing. When it came, he low-crawled to the next wounded man. This soldier had lost his right foot to artillery shrapnel. Bone protruded from the stump. Blood pumped from severed arteries. Woodson applied a tourniquet above the knee, tightened it until bleeding stopped, gave morphine, started a plasma transfusion. The soldier would live if evacuated quickly, but evacuation was impossible. By 07:30, Woodson had treated 12 wounded men. His own wounds continued bleeding. He ignored the pain. More soldiers needed help. He moved from casualty to casualty under constant fire. The beach was chaos. Landing craft burned in the surf. Tanks sat disabled on the sand. Bodies lay everywhere. The smell of cordite and blood filled the air. Officers tried to organize surviving troops, but German fire pinned everyone down. Woodson found a shell crater 20 yards from the waterline. The depression was 4 feet deep. It provided cover from direct fire. He dragged wounded men into the crater one by one. This became his aid station. Other soldiers saw what he was doing and began bringing casualties to the crater. If you want to see how Woodson's impossible 30 hours unfolded on the deadliest beach in history, please hit that like button. It helps share these forgotten heroes. Subscribe for more. Back to Woodson. At 0800, Woodson heard shouting from the water. 3 soldiers had been swept away from a landing craft when its anchor cable broke in the heavy surf. The current was pulling them into deeper water beyond the beach obstacles. All 3 wore full combat equipment: steel helmets, rifles, ammunition, packs. The weight was dragging them under. Woodson watched the 3 men struggle. The nearest was 20 yards offshore. The farthest was 35 yards out. German machine gun fire continued sweeping the beach and the surf. Any man who entered the water to attempt a rescue would be exposed to enemy fire for at least 2 minutes with no cover. Woodson looked down at his medical bag. Morphine syrettes, bandages, plasma, the supplies that could save wounded men on the beach. If he went into the water, the bag would be lost. If he drowned, no medic would remain in this section of Omaha Beach. 12 wounded men in his crater were waiting for treatment. More casualties were arriving every minute. The 3 soldiers in the water were screaming, going under, coming back up, going under again. In 30 seconds, they would be dead. Woodson stood up. His shrapnel wounds sent pain through his left leg. Blood soaked his uniform from thigh to boot. German machine gun fire tore through the air around him, and Waverly Woodson ran toward the surf. Woodson entered the water at 08:02. The surf pushed against his legs. Each step sent pain through his shrapnel wounds. The first drowning soldier was 15 yards offshore, sinking. Woodson pushed through waist-deep water, then chest-deep. His boots lost contact with the sand. He began swimming. German machine gun fire raked the water around him. Bullets created small splashes where they hit the surface. Woodson kept his head low, swam harder. The drowning soldier went under. Woodson dove, reached out in the murky water, felt fabric, grabbed the soldier's equipment harness, pulled up. They broke the surface together. The soldier was unconscious, not breathing. Woodson got behind him, wrapped his left arm across the soldier's chest, used his right arm and legs to swim toward shore. The current pushed parallel to the beach. Woodson angled against it. Progress was slow. A mortar shell exploded 30 yards away. The concussion wave hit them underwater. Woodson's ears rang. He kept swimming. His wounded left leg was nearly useless. He kicked with his right leg, pulled with his right arm, dragged the unconscious soldier toward the beach. After 3 minutes, Woodson's boots touched sand. He stood, pulled the soldier upright, dragged him through the surf onto the beach, laid him face down on the sand. pressed on his back to expel water from his lungs. The soldier coughed. Water came up. He gasped, began breathing. One saved. Woodson turned back toward the water. The second drowning soldier was 25 yards offshore, still struggling, going under, coming up, going under again. Woodson entered the surf. His shrapnel wounds had reopened during the first rescue. Blood ran down his leg. Salt water burned in the wounds. He ignored the pain, pushed into deeper water, started swimming. The second soldier saw Woodson approaching, panicked, grabbed at Woodson when he got close, pulled Woodson under. They both went down. Woodson broke free underwater, surfaced behind the soldier, got him in a cross-chest carry. The soldier fought. Woodson held tight, began swimming towards shore. German artillery opened up. Shells landed in the water. One hit 50 yards to the left, another 40 yards to the right. The Germans were walking fire across the invasion zone. Woodson swam faster. The soldier stopped struggling, went limp, either unconscious or dead. Woodson reached the beach, dragged the soldier onto the sand, checked for breathing. Nothing. Started artificial respiration, pressed on the back, released, pressed again, kept rhythm. After 1 minute the soldier coughed, vomited seawater, began breathing. 2 saved. The third drowning soldier was 40 yards offshore, drifting farther out with the current. Woodson could barely see him through the smoke and spray. The man's head went under, did not come back up. Woodson entered the water again. His left leg would not support his weight. He fell forward into the surf, started swimming with both arms. His leg trailed behind him. Pain radiated through his thigh and buttocks with each stroke. He swam for 5 minutes, reached the area where the third soldier had gone under, dove, searched underwater, felt nothing, surfaced, looked around, saw a helmet floating 10 yards away, swam to it, dove again, felt something, grabbed it, an equipment strap, pulled up. The third soldier broke the surface, not breathing, face was blue. Woodson got him in rescue position, started back toward shore. The current was stronger this far out. Swimming against it was nearly impossible with a wounded leg and an unconscious soldier. Woodson made slow progress. Each stroke was agony. His left leg was useless. His right leg cramped. He kept kicking, kept pulling. The beach seemed impossibly far away. After 10 minutes, Woodson's right boot touched sand. He stood, dragged the third soldier through the surf, laid him on the beach, started artificial respiration, pressed, released, pressed, released. 2 minutes. 3 minutes. The soldier was not responding. Woodson turned the soldier over, cleared his airway, started mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, breathed into the soldier's lungs. Chest rose, fell, breathed again, kept rhythm. After 2 minutes, the soldier coughed. Water came up. He gasped, began breathing. 3 saved. Woodson crawled back to his crater aid station. He could not walk. His left leg was swollen to twice normal size. Infection was spreading. He pulled himself across the sand using his arms. Reached the crater. 12 wounded men were waiting. At 0900, Woodson resumed treating casualties. His medical supplies were nearly depleted. Morphine was running low. Bandages were scarce. He used what remained efficiently. 1 morphine syringe per casualty instead of 2. Smaller bandages where possible. A soldier arrived with his left hand severed at the wrist. The hand hung by tendons and skin, partially attached, mangled. The bones were shattered. Arteries were cut. The hand could not be saved. Woodson examined the injury. He had never performed an amputation. Medical training covered the procedure theoretically. He had practiced on training dummies, never on a living person. He had no surgical instruments except scissors and a knife from his medical bag. No anesthetic except morphine. He gave the soldier 2 morphine syringes, 1 in each thigh. Waited 5 minutes for the morphine to take effect. The soldier was still conscious, still feeling pain, but the morphine dulled the sensation enough to proceed. Woodson cut through the remaining tendons connecting the ruined hand to the wrist. The soldier screamed. Woodson worked quickly, cut through tissue, cut through the last section of skin. The hand came free. He dropped it in the sand. Blood poured from the wrist stump. Woodson applied pressure, located the severed arteries, tied them off with suture material from his medical bag, applied sulfur powder to prevent infection, wrapped the stump in pressure bandages, used all his remaining bandages on this one injury. The amputation took 15 minutes. The soldier survived, went into shock. Woodson elevated his legs, covered him with a blanket taken from a dead soldier nearby. By 1000, Woodson had treated 63 wounded men since landing. His medical bag was empty. He borrowed supplies from other medics arriving on the beach. Staff Sergeant Alfred Bell, from the 320th, brought morphine and plasma. Corporal Eugene Worthy brought bandages and sulfur powder. More casualties arrived throughout the morning. The invasion was progressing. American troops were pushing inland, but the cost was enormous. Bodies covered the beach. Wounded men lay everywhere. Aid stations were overwhelmed. German artillery continued firing. Mortars landed randomly. Machine gun fire decreased as American forces eliminated pillboxes, but snipers remained active on the bluffs. Medics were targets. Red Cross armbands made them visible. Several medics were shot while treating casualties. At 1100, naval destroyers moved close to shore. USS Frankfurt, USS Doyle, USS McCook. The destroyers came within 800 yards of the beach. Their 5-inch guns targeted German positions on the bluffs. The naval gunfire suppressed German artillery. American troops advanced faster. Woodson continued working. He cleaned wounds, reset broken bones, applied tourniquets, administered morphine. His movements were automatic, muscle memory from training. His mind was detached, operating on instinct rather than conscious thought. At 1300, Woodson treated a soldier with a sucking chest wound. The bullet had entered below the left shoulder blade, exited through the front of the chest. Air was being sucked into the chest cavity. The lung was collapsing. The soldier was suffocating. Woodson needed to seal both wounds. He cut open morphine syringe packages, used the waxy paper to cover the entry wound, taped it on 3 sides, created a one-way valve. Air could escape, but not enter. Repeated the process on the exit wound. Administered morphine. The soldier's breathing stabilized. At 1500, Staff Sergeant Bell examined Woodson's leg. The infection was spreading rapidly. Red streaks extended up his thigh toward his groin. The lymphatic system was compromised. Bell cleaned the wounds with iodine solution, applied fresh bandages, gave Woodson sulfa tablets, ordered him to rest. Woodson refused. More casualties were arriving. The aid station needed every medic. Bell did not argue. There were not enough medics on Omaha Beach. Everyone was essential. By 1800 on June 6th, Woodson had been working for 11 hours. He had treated 107 wounded soldiers. His fever was rising. Vision was blurring. Balance was failing. His left leg was completely useless. He crawled between casualties instead of walking. But wounded men were still arriving at his crater aid station, and the sun was setting over the bloodiest beach in military history. Night fell on Omaha Beach at 2100 on June 6, 1944. Temperature dropped to 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Woodson wore only his blood-soaked uniform, no jacket, no blanket. He shivered between treating casualties. His fever made the cold worse. Chills alternated with sweats. German artillery fire continued after dark. Sporadic shells landed among the wreckage on the beach. The Germans could not see targets in darkness. They fired based on memory and estimation. Some shells landed in the water. Others exploded on the sand. A few hit concentrations of troops and equipment. Woodson worked under blackout conditions. He used a small flashlight covered with red cellophane to examine wounds. The red light was less visible to German observers on the bluffs. Still risky, but necessary. He could not treat wounds in complete darkness. At 2200, a soldier arrived at the aid station with both legs broken. A tank had reversed over him in darkness. The driver had not seen him lying wounded on the sand. The tank treads had crushed both femurs. The soldier was screaming, conscious, in agony. Woodson gave him 3 morphine syrettes, more than the standard dose. The soldier needed it. The pain was extreme. Woodson waited 10 minutes for the morphine to take effect. The screaming decreased to moans. The soldier's eyes were glazed, barely conscious. Woodson examined the legs. Both femurs were shattered. He could feel bone fragments through the skin. The right leg was bent at an unnatural angle. The left leg had compound fractures with bone protruding through the flesh. He needed to splint both legs, prevent further damage, stop bone fragments from severing arteries. He had no proper splints. He improvised, used broken rifle stocks as splints, wrapped them against the legs with torn uniform strips, tied them tight enough to immobilize the fractures, but not so tight as to cut off circulation. The process took 30 minutes. The soldier passed out from pain despite the morphine, better unconscious than screaming. Woodson moved to the next casualty. At 2300, Staff Sergeant Bell brought hot coffee from a supply dump established inland. The coffee was weak, made from old grounds reused multiple times, but it was hot. Woodson drank an entire canteen cup, first liquid he had consumed in 16 hours, besides contaminated water from other soldiers' canteens. The caffeine helped. His mind cleared slightly. Vision improved. But his left leg was worse. The infection had spread above his knee. His entire thigh was swollen, hot to the touch. The skin was discolored. Red streaks extended toward his hip. Bell examined the leg again. He said Woodson needed evacuation to a hospital ship, needed intravenous antibiotics, needed surgical debridement of the infected tissue. Woodson refused. The aid station still had wounded men waiting for treatment. Evacuation would take hours. Those hours would leave the station short 1 medic. At midnight on June 7th, Woodson had been working for 17 hours. He had treated 128 wounded soldiers. His personal count. He marked each casualty on a list using a grease pencil on the back of a ration box. Names when he knew them. Description when he did not. Injury type, treatment given, time. The list was methodical, organized. It helped him track morphine dosages, helped him remember which casualties needed follow-up treatment, helped him maintain mental clarity despite fever and exhaustion. More wounded arrived throughout the night. Landing craft continued bringing reinforcements. Some craft hit mines. Others took artillery fire. Each explosion created new casualties. The wounded were brought to aid stations. Woodson's crater was one of 3 functioning aid stations on this section of beach. At 0100 on June 7th, Woodson treated a soldier with severe burns. A German artillery shell had hit an ammunition dump. The explosion had ignited gasoline stored nearby. The soldier had been standing next to the dump when it exploded. Flash burns covered his face, neck, hands, and arms. The skin was blistered. In some areas, it was charred black. In others, it had peeled away entirely. The soldier was conscious, screaming. The pain from burns was worse than gunshot wounds, worse than broken bones. Burns damaged nerve endings in ways that produced constant agony. Woodson had limited supplies for burns. He had burn ointment, small tubes, not nearly enough for the extent of these injuries. He applied what he had to the worst areas, face and hands, wrapped the arms loosely in gauze, gave morphine, 2 syrettes. The soldier needed more, but morphine supplies were critically low. At 0200, German artillery began a sustained barrage on the beach. The bombardment was heavier than previous night firing. Shells landed in clusters. The Germans were attempting to disrupt the American buildup on the beach, prevent reinforcements from organizing for the push inland. Woodson and the wounded men in his crater pressed themselves flat against the sand. Shells exploded around them. One landed 15 yards away. The blast threw sand and shrapnel over the crater. Dirt rained down on the wounded men. The noise was deafening. Woodson's ears rang. The barrage lasted 20 minutes. When it ended, Woodson counted casualties. 3 men in his crater had been killed by shrapnel. 5 more were wounded. Men he had already treated now had new injuries. He began treating the new wounds, applied fresh bandages over old ones, gave morphine where available. At 0300, Woodson's vision began failing. The fever was affecting his eyesight. Objects appeared blurred. Distances were difficult to judge. He relied on touch more than vision when examining wounds, felt for broken bones, felt for arterial bleeding, felt for the temperature differences that indicated infection. His hands still worked. Muscle memory guided them. Even with failing vision, he could apply bandages correctly, could tie tourniquets, could find veins for plasma transfusions. Training had made the movements automatic. At 0400, a soldier arrived at the aid station with a bayonet wound through the abdomen. He had been in hand-to-hand combat with a German soldier in a pillbox inland. The German had driven a bayonet into his stomach before being killed. The blade had penetrated 4 inches deep. The soldier had walked back to the beach holding his intestines inside the wound with his hands. Woodson examined the injury. The bayonet had punctured the abdominal wall. Intestines were visible. Some had been cut. The soldier was going into shock. Pale, breathing rapidly, pulse was weak. Woodson could not repair internal damage. He could only stabilize. He pushed the intestines back inside the abdominal cavity, covered the wound with sulfa powder, applied a large pressure bandage, gave morphine. The soldier needed surgery, needed a hospital ship, but evacuation was still difficult. Landing craft were prioritized for bringing supplies and reinforcements ashore. Wounded evacuations came second. At 0500, first light appeared over the English Channel. Woodson had been working for 22 hours without sleep. His count was 147 wounded soldiers treated. His medical supplies were gone. He was borrowing from other medics. His left leg was twice normal size. His fever was over 103 degrees. His vision was blurred. His balance was failing. Staff Sergeant Bell approached the crater. He was carrying medical supplies and bad news. A German counterattack was forming 2 miles inland. American forces were requesting all available medics to move forward. Casualties from the counterattack would overwhelm aid stations. More medics were needed at the front. Bell looked at Woodson, at his infected leg, at his fever-glazed eyes, at the blood covering his uniform. He asked if Woodson could move. Woodson looked at the wounded men still waiting in his crater, looked at the supplies in Bell's hands, looked at the beach behind them where landing craft were still bringing reinforcements ashore. He nodded once. Staff Sergeant Bell handed him fresh bandages and morphine syrettes and pointed inland toward the sound of renewed fighting. At 0530 on June 7th, Woodson left his crater aid station on Omaha Beach. He crawled the first 20 yards. His left leg would not support his weight. Staff Sergeant Bell helped him stand, gave him a rifle to use as a crutch. Woodson leaned on the rifle and began moving inland. The beach behind him was covered with wounded and dead. Equipment lay scattered across the sand. Destroyed landing craft burned in the surf. Tanks sat disabled where mines had blown their tracks off. The smell of cordite, blood, and diesel fuel hung in the air. Woodson moved slowly. Each step sent pain through his infected leg. The rifle crutch helped, but walking was still difficult. Bell stayed with him. Other medics from the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion moved inland in small groups. Private First Class Warren Capers, Corporal Eugene Worthy, all heading toward the fighting 2 miles ahead. The path from the beach led through a gap in the seawall blown by engineers. Beyond the seawall was open ground for 300 yards, then hedgerows. The hedgerows were ancient earthen walls covered with thick vegetation. They divided French farmland into small fields. Each hedgerow was 4 to 6 feet high, provided excellent defensive positions. German forces had retreated into the hedgerows after losing the beach. They were using the terrain for defense, machine gun positions, mortar teams, snipers. Every hedgerow was a potential ambush point. American troops were advancing slowly, clearing each hedgerow line before moving to the next. Woodson reached the first hedgerow at 0600. He found 3 wounded soldiers behind the earthen wall. All 3 had been hit during the advance from the beach. One had a bullet wound through the calf. Another had shrapnel in his shoulder. The third had taken a rifle round through the hand. Woodson treated them in sequence, applied bandages, gave morphine, tagged them for evacuation. The process took 15 minutes. By the time he finished, more wounded arrived. 4 soldiers from a squad that had assaulted a German machine gun position. 2 were dead, 2 were wounded. At 06:30, American artillery began firing from positions established on the beach during the night. 105mm howitzers. The shells passed overhead with a freight train sound. They landed on German positions deeper inland. The artillery was supporting the advance, softening enemy defenses before infantry assaulted. Woodson continued moving forward with the advance. He followed behind the assault troops by 50 yards, close enough to reach wounded quickly, far enough back to avoid being caught in direct firefights. Other medics used the same spacing, standard doctrine. At 0700, Woodson reached a farmhouse that had been converted into a casualty collection point. The building had been cleared of German troops an hour earlier. Now it served as a temporary aid station. Wounded soldiers lay on the ground floor. A Navy corpsman was treating them. Lieutenant James Harris from the 1st Infantry Division was coordinating evacuations. Harris saw Woodson's condition, saw the infected leg, the fever, the exhaustion. He ordered Woodson to stop and receive treatment. Woodson refused. He had medical supplies. Wounded men needed treatment. He would keep working. Harris did not push the issue. He needed every medic available. The counterattack was building. Intelligence reports indicated German forces were massing for a push toward the beach. If they broke through American lines, they could reach the invasion zone, could disrupt the landing operations, could turn D-Day into a failure. At 07:30, Woodson left the farmhouse, moved forward again. The sounds of fighting were louder, machine gun fire, rifle shots, explosions. The battle was half a mile ahead. He increased his pace, used the rifle crutch to support his weight, ignored the pain. At 0800, Woodson encountered a squad pinned down by German machine gun fire. The squad was spread along a hedgerow. Unable to advance, unable to retreat, the machine gun was firing from a position 200 yards ahead. Every time an American soldier raised his head above the hedgerow, the machine gun fired. Several soldiers were wounded. Lying behind the earthen wall, bleeding, Woodson crawled to the nearest wounded soldier. Bullet wound through the upper arm. The bullet had shattered the humerus. Bone fragments were visible in the wound. Woodson applied a splint made from broken tree branches, wrapped it with bandages, gave morphine, tagged the soldier. German mortar fire began landing near the hedgerow. The Germans had spotted the pinned-down squad, were targeting them. Shells exploded in the open field behind the hedgerow. Shrapnel flew through the air. Woodson pressed himself flat against the ground. At 08:30, American tanks arrived, 2 M4 Shermans. They moved along the hedgerow line, used their 75mm guns to suppress the German machine gun position. High explosive shells. The machine gun stopped firing. The squad advanced. Woodson moved with them. At 0900, Woodson reached an intersection of hedgerows, a crossroads in the French farmland. American forces had established a strong point there. Soldiers were digging foxholes, setting up machine gun positions, building defenses against the expected German counterattack. Wounded soldiers were gathered at the crossroads, waiting for evacuation. Woodson began treating them. A soldier with a sucking chest wound, another with a compound fracture of the tibia, a third with multiple shrapnel wounds across his back and legs. At 0930, German artillery opened up on the crossroads. The Germans knew American forces were consolidating there, were attempting to break up the strong point before it was fully established. Shells landed in clusters, 88mm rounds, accurate, deadly. Woodson and the wounded took cover in a drainage ditch beside the crossroads. The ditch was 3 feet deep, filled with muddy water. They lay in the water while shells exploded around them. One shell landed 10 feet from the ditch. The blast wave rolled over them. Dirt and debris rained down. The bombardment lasted 10 minutes. When it ended, Woodson climbed out of the ditch. 3 of the wounded soldiers had been hit by shrapnel during the bombardment. New wounds on top of old ones. He treated the new injuries, applied fresh bandages, used the last of his morphine. At 10:00, Woodson had no medical supplies remaining. He walked back toward the beach to resupply. The walk took 30 minutes. His infected leg was failing. Each step required conscious effort. The rifle crutch was the only thing keeping him upright. He reached a supply dump established near the seawall. Medical supplies were stacked in wooden crates. Morphine, bandages, sulfa powder, plasma. He filled his medical bag, took extra supplies, put them in his pockets, in his helmet, anywhere he could carry them. At 10:45, a Navy corpsman at the supply dump examined Woodson's leg. The infection had spread to his hip. Red streaks extended up his left side. The corpsman said Woodson needed immediate evacuation, needed surgery, needed antibiotics that were not available on the beach. Woodson refused evacuation. He had fresh supplies. Wounded men were waiting at the crossroads. He turned and began walking back inland. The corpsman did not try to stop him. Watched him limp away using a rifle as a crutch. Shook his head. At 11:15, Woodson reached the crossroads again. More wounded had arrived during his absence. A squad had been ambushed in the hedgerows, 5 casualties. 1 was dead, 4 were wounded. Woodson began treating them. At 11:30, the German counterattack began. Artillery fire increased. Shells landed continuously around the crossroads. Then German infantry appeared, moving through the hedgerows, supported by tanks. 2 Panzer IVs. The tanks fired their 75mm guns, high explosive and armor-piercing rounds. American forces at the crossroads returned fire. Machine guns, rifles, bazookas. The fighting was intense, close range. Soldiers were hit on both sides. Wounded Germans and Americans lay mixed together in the fields between hedgerows. Woodson continued working. He treated wounded, regardless of uniform. An American soldier with a chest wound, a German soldier with a leg wound, another American with shrapnel injuries. The nationality did not matter. They were wounded. He was a medic. His job was to save them. At 1200, Woodson had been working for 29 hours. Since 06:30 on June 6th, 29 hours without sleep, without proper food, without treatment for his own wounds. His count was 183 wounded soldiers treated. His fever was over 104 degrees. His vision was fading. His left leg was completely non-functional. He could barely stand even with the rifle crutch. Staff Sergeant Bell found him at the crossroads. Bell had been searching for him for an hour. Bell looked at Woodson's condition, at the infected leg, at the fever-bright eyes, at the way Woodson swayed while standing. Bell made a decision. He called for stretcher bearers, told them to take Woodson to the beach, to put him on a landing craft, to evacuate him to a hospital ship. Woodson tried to refuse. Bell did not give him a choice. The stretcher bearers picked Woodson up, started carrying him toward the beach. Woodson looked back at the crossroads, at the wounded soldiers still waiting, at the fighting still continuing. And for the first time in 29 hours, Corporal Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. was not working. The stretcher bearers carried Woodson toward Omaha Beach at 12:15 on June 7th, 1944. The journey took 45 minutes. The path was difficult. Hedgerows, shell craters, destroyed equipment, bodies. The bearers had to navigate around obstacles while keeping the stretcher level. Woodson lay on the stretcher, watching the sky. Gray clouds, occasional breaks showing blue. Aircraft flew overhead. American fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts, patrolling for German aircraft that never appeared. The Luftwaffe had abandoned Normandy airspace. Allied air superiority was total. At 1300, the stretcher bearers reached the beach. The scene had changed since Woodson left at 05:30. More equipment was ashore. Trucks, artillery pieces, ammunition. Supply dumps were organized in rows behind the seawall. Engineers had cleared most of the beach obstacles. landing craft could approach more easily. The bearers carried Woodson to an evacuation point near the waterline. Wounded soldiers were gathered there waiting for transport to hospital ships, approximately 50 men. Some on stretchers, others sitting or lying on the sand. All were tagged with information about their injuries and treatment received. A Navy corpsman examined Woodson, checked his wounds, took his temperature, 104.6 degrees Fahrenheit, checked his pulse, rapid, weak, checked the infection in his left leg. The corpsman's expression showed concern. He marked Woodson's tag with a red cross, priority evacuation, serious condition. At 13:30, a landing craft vehicle personnel approached the beach. The LCVP was returning from a hospital ship offshore after delivering supplies. It could take wounded back. The corpsman selected 20 men for evacuation. Woodson was among them. The most serious cases went first. The stretcher bearers carried Woodson into the surf, waded to the LCVP, handed the stretcher up to Navy personnel aboard the craft. The sailors placed Woodson on the deck with other wounded. The LCVP was crowded. 20 stretchers took up most of the available space. At 13:45, the LCVP departed the beach, turned toward the hospital ships anchored 5 miles offshore. The channel was rough. Waves were 3 to 4 feet. The landing craft pitched and rolled. Several wounded men vomited from seasickness. Woodson closed his eyes, tried to ignore the motion. The journey took 30 minutes. At 14:15, the LCVP reached USS Achernar, a attack transport ship converted to serve as a hospital ship. White hull with red crosses painted on the sides. The ship had 400 hospital beds, 29 surgeons, 96 nurses, fully equipped operating rooms. Sailors aboard Achernar lowered cargo nets. The wounded were lifted from the LCVP in their stretchers using rope slings. Woodson was raised 50 feet to the main deck. Sailors grabbed the stretcher, carried him inside. The interior was painted white. Electric lights. Clean. Organized. A stark contrast to the beach. Woodson was taken to a triage station. A Navy surgeon examined him. Lieutenant Commander Robert Shaw. Shaw looked at the infected leg, felt the swollen tissue, checked the fever, checked the wounds. 24 hours old, contaminated with sand and seawater, deep tissue infection, possible sepsis. Shaw ordered immediate surgery. Woodson needed debridement of the infected tissue, needed intravenous antibiotics, needed blood transfusions to replace what he had lost. The surgery could not wait. Every hour delayed increased the risk of losing the leg, or losing the patient. At 14:45, Woodson was taken to an operating room. Nurses prepped him for surgery, cut away his blood-soaked uniform, washed his body, started an intravenous line in his right arm, administered saline solution to combat dehydration, drew blood for typing and cross-matching. An anesthesiologist administered ether through a mask. Woodson breathed deeply, counted backward from 100 as instructed. 99, 98, 97. He lost consciousness at 94. Lieutenant Commander Shaw began surgery at 1500. He made an incision along Woodson's left thigh, opened the infected tissue, found extensive damage. The shrapnel had carried contaminated material deep into the muscle. Sand, fabric from the uniform, bacteria. The infection had spread through multiple muscle groups. Shaw removed dead tissue, cut away infected muscle, flushed the wound cavity with saline solution, located each piece of shrapnel, removed them with forceps. 7 metal fragments total, ranging from 1 to 3 centimeters in length. He placed them in a metal tray. They would be saved for Woodson. The surgery lasted 2 hours. At 1700, Shaw closed the wound, left drains in place to remove fluid, applied pressure bandages. Woodson remained unconscious from the anesthesia. He was taken to a recovery ward, placed in a bed. Clean white sheets, a pillow. the first bed he had slept in since leaving England 5 days earlier. Nurses monitored his vital signs: temperature, pulse, blood pressure, respiration. Everything was recorded on a chart at the foot of his bed. At 1800, Woodson regained consciousness. He was confused, disoriented, did not remember the surgery, did not know where he was. A nurse explained. He was aboard USS Achernar. He had been evacuated from Omaha Beach. He had undergone surgery. He needed to rest. Woodson asked about the casualties on the beach, asked about the wounded at the crossroads, asked about the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. The nurse had no information. She told him to sleep. He closed his eyes but did not sleep. His mind was on the beach, on the wounded men he had left behind. At 2000, Lieutenant Commander Shaw visited the recovery ward. He examined Woodson's leg, checked the bandages, checked for bleeding. Everything looked stable. The surgery had been successful. The infection would take days to clear, but the leg was saved. Woodson would walk again. Shaw asked Woodson about his service on the beach. How long had he worked? How many casualties had he treated? Woodson gave his count. 183 wounded soldiers, 29 hours of continuous work. Shaw was impressed. He said he would recommend Woodson for a commendation. At 2100, nurses brought food. Real food, hot, clean. Mashed potatoes, gravy, canned vegetables, bread, coffee. The first proper meal Woodson had eaten since June 5th. He ate slowly. His stomach had shrunk from not eating. He could only manage half the portion. Throughout the night, other wounded arrived on Achernar. Landing craft brought them from the beach. The hospital ship filled rapidly. By midnight, all 400 beds were occupied. Some wounded were placed on the deck. Surgery continued around the clock. Multiple operating rooms working simultaneously. At 0200 on June 8th, Woodson woke. His fever had broken. Temperature was down to 100.2 degrees, still elevated, but improving. The antibiotics were working. The infection was responding to treatment. His left leg was still painful, but the swelling had decreased slightly. He lay in bed listening to the sounds of the ship. Engines running, sailors working, wounded men moaning. Some cried out in their sleep. Nightmares about the battle, about the beach, about what they had seen. Woodson understood. He had seen it too. At 0600, nurses changed Woodson's bandages, checked the surgical incisions, checked the drains. Everything was healing properly. No signs of continued infection. The tissue was pink, healthy. Blood flow was good. Lieutenant Commander Shaw visited again. He was pleased with Woodson's progress, said Woodson would remain on Achernar for 3 more days. Then he would be transferred to a hospital in England, would spend several weeks recovering, would likely be discharged from active duty. His combat service was over. Woodson asked when he could return to duty. Shaw looked at him with surprise. Return to duty? After 29 hours of continuous work while wounded, after treating 183 casualties, after nearly dying from infection, Woodson wanted to return to duty. Shaw said recovery would take months. The leg needed time to heal. Woodson needed time to regain his strength. There would be no returning to combat. Woodson would go home, back to the United States. The war was over for him. But Woodson was not thinking about going home. He was thinking about the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, about Staff Sergeant Bell, about Private First Class Capers, about Corporal Worthy, about the other medics still working on Omaha Beach, about the wounded soldiers still arriving, about the job that was not finished. And as USS Achernar swayed gently in the channel current 5 miles from the bloodiest beach in history, Corporal Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. began planning how he would convince the Navy doctors to let him return to his unit. Woodson remained aboard USS Achernar for 4 days, June 8th through June 11th, 1944. During that time, his condition improved steadily. The infection cleared. Fever dropped to normal. Strength returned. The surgical incisions healed without complications. On June 12th, Woodson was transferred to a hospital ship bound for England, HMS Amsterdam, a British vessel converted for medical service. The ship departed Normandy waters at 0800, carrying 480 wounded American soldiers. The journey across the Channel took 6 hours. Woodson arrived at Southampton, England at 1400. Ambulances transported the wounded from the docks to various hospitals. Woodson was assigned to the 132nd General Hospital in Wiltshire, a facility that specialized in surgical recovery. 3,000 beds, fully staffed with American medical personnel. At the hospital, Woodson was placed in a ward with 30 other recovering soldiers. Most were D-Day casualties. Some had been wounded on Omaha Beach, others at Utah Beach, some from airborne operations inland. All shared similar experiences. All had seen the worst of the invasion. Doctors examined Woodson daily, checked his wounds, changed bandages, monitored his recovery. The prognosis was good. The infection was completely gone. The muscle tissue was regenerating. Scarring would be permanent, but function would return. He would walk without assistance within 3 weeks. Physical therapy began on June 15th. Woodson learned to walk again. Started with short distances, 10 feet, 20 feet, using crutches for support. The left leg was weak. Muscles had atrophied during the infection. Daily exercises rebuilt strength gradually. By June 20th, Woodson could walk 100 feet without crutches, still limping, still experiencing pain, but functional. He asked doctors when he could return to his unit. They said minimum 6 weeks additional recovery, possibly longer. His combat service was finished. During his recovery, Woodson learned what had happened to the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion after June 7th. The unit had remained on Omaha Beach for 5 months, maintained balloons over the invasion area, moved inland as American forces advanced, deployed balloons over supply depots and headquarters positions. 3 men from the battalion had been killed on D-Day: Private Edward Talley, Private Albert Cole, Private Willie Hines, all killed by German artillery fire while deploying balloons on the beach. 17 more had been wounded. Woodson had treated 12 of them. The battalion had received commendation from General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander. Eisenhower praised the 320th for conducting its mission with courage and determination, said the unit proved an important element of the air defense team. The commendation was official recognition of the battalion's service. Woodson also learned about casualties from D-Day. The official numbers were staggering. American forces suffered approximately 10,000 casualties on June 6th, 2,000 killed, 8,000 wounded. Omaha Beach accounted for nearly half, over 4,000 casualties on one beach, the bloodiest day in United States military history. On June 25th, Captain John Schwab visited Woodson at the hospital. Schwab commanded Battery A of the 320th. He had been on Omaha Beach coordinating balloon deployments while Woodson treated wounded. Schwab brought news. Woodson was being recommended for the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration for valor. Schwab had submitted the recommendation through official channels. The paperwork detailed Woodson's actions on June 6th and 7th. 29 hours of continuous work, 183 casualties treated, 3 men saved from drowning, multiple amputations performed, all while seriously wounded. Schwab said the recommendation had strong support. General John Lee had reviewed it. Lee commanded all logistics and support operations in the European theater. He believed Woodson's actions warranted the Medal of Honor. The recommendation had been forwarded to higher headquarters for approval. Woodson was surprised. He had not expected recognition. He had done his job, treated wounded soldiers. That was what medics did. He did not think his actions were extraordinary. Schwab disagreed. Schwab said Woodson's courage and endurance were exceptional, deserved the highest recognition. On July 1st, Woodson received the Bronze Star. The award was presented in a ceremony at the hospital. Colonel Thomas Davis conducted the presentation, read the citation aloud, described Woodson's actions on Omaha Beach, his treatment of casualties under fire, his rescue of drowning soldiers, his continued service despite serious wounds. The Bronze Star was a significant decoration, fourth highest award for valor, but it was not the Medal of Honor. Woodson wondered what happened to that recommendation. Schwab said it was still under review. These things took time. Be patient. By mid-July, Woodson could walk normally. The limp was minimal. Pain was manageable. Strength had returned to his left leg. Doctors cleared him for light duty. He was assigned to the hospital staff, helped treat other recovering soldiers, assisted with physical therapy. His medical training was useful. In August, Woodson was promoted to sergeant. The promotion came with a pay increase, $21 additional per month. More importantly, it came with increased responsibility. He supervised other medics working at the hospital, trained new medical personnel arriving from the United States. On August 15th, Stars and Stripes published an article about Woodson, the military newspaper. The article described his actions on D-Day, called him a hero, said he and other medics from the 320th covered themselves with glory. The article was widely read. Soldiers throughout the European theater learned Woodson's story. Black newspapers in the United States picked up the story. The Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, the Baltimore Afro-American. They called Woodson the #1 invasion hero, praised his courage, noted he was part of the only African-American combat unit at Omaha Beach. The coverage brought national attention. In September, Woodson received letters from home. His mother, his father, friends, all had read about his actions. All were proud. His hometown of Philadelphia planned a celebration when he returned. The city wanted to honor him publicly, but the Medal of Honor recommendation remained unresolved. Woodson asked Schwab about it. Schwab said it was still under review. No decision had been made. The process was slow, bureaucratic. Be patient. On October 1st, Woodson learned the recommendation had been downgraded. Not Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross instead, the second highest military decoration. Still significant, but not the Medal of Honor. No explanation was given. The decision came from higher headquarters. Final. No appeal process existed. Woodson would receive the Distinguished Service Cross, not the Medal of Honor. Schwab was angry. He believed the downgrade was unjust. Woodson's actions clearly met Medal of Honor criteria: extraordinary valor, risk of life beyond the call of duty, multiple witnesses, documented evidence. Everything required was present, yet the recommendation was downgraded. Other officers shared Schwab's opinion. Lieutenant Commander Shaw, the surgeon who operated on Woodson aboard USS Achernar, he wrote a letter supporting the Medal of Honor, described Woodson's physical condition when he arrived on the hospital ship, said no man could work 29 hours in that condition without extraordinary courage. Navy corpsmen who worked with Woodson wrote statements. Staff Sergeant Bell, Private First Class Capers, Corporal Worthy, all described what they witnessed. All supported the Medal of Honor recommendation. All were ignored. In November, Woodson received the Distinguished Service Cross in a ceremony at the hospital. General John Lee presented the medal, read the citation, praised Woodson's heroism, shook his hand, said America was proud of him. But Woodson noticed something during the ceremony. Of the 400 Medals of Honor awarded during World War II, not one had gone to an African-American soldier. 0. Despite over 1 million Black Americans serving in the military, despite countless acts of valor, despite documented heroism equal to or exceeding that of white recipients. The pattern was clear. The system was broken. And on November 18, 1944, as Sergeant Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. stood at attention while General John Lee pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on his uniform, he understood that the color of his skin had cost him the Medal of Honor he deserved. Woodson remained in England through December 1944. He continued working at the 132nd General Hospital, treated recovering soldiers, supervised other medics, trained new medical personnel. His left leg had healed completely. The limp was barely noticeable. He was fully capable of returning to combat duty. He requested reassignment to the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. The request was denied. His medical records indicated he had suffered serious wounds requiring major surgery. Army policy prohibited returning seriously wounded soldiers to combat zones. Woodson would remain in England on hospital duty. In January 1945, the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion left France. The unit was reassigned to the United States for rest and retraining. Plans called for deployment to the Pacific Theater. The war against Japan was expected to continue for years. Barrage balloons would be needed for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. The battalion arrived at Camp Stewart, Georgia in February. Woodson remained in England. He would not rejoin his unit. In March, he received orders. He was being sent home. Medical discharge. His service was ending. On March 28, 1945, Woodson boarded a transport ship at Southampton, bound for New York. The crossing took 8 days. He arrived at New York Harbor on April 5th, was processed through a separation center, received his discharge papers, was officially separated from the United States Army on April 8, 1945. The war in Europe ended 1 month later, May 8th. Germany surrendered. The war in the Pacific continued until August. Japan surrendered after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Woodson was a civilian by then, living in Philadelphia, working, trying to adjust to peacetime. Adjustment was difficult. Woodson had nightmares about Omaha Beach, about wounded soldiers, about men drowning in the surf, about the smell of blood and cordite. The memories were vivid, persistent. They did not fade with time. He married Joanne Catherine in 1947. They had met before the war. She had waited for him. They built a life together, had children. Woodson worked as a medical technician. His Army training was valuable in civilian hospitals. He was good at his job. But he never talked about D-Day, never mentioned the 30 hours on Omaha Beach, never described the casualties he treated. His family knew he had served, knew he had been wounded, knew he received medals, but they did not know the details. Woodson kept the memories private. In the years after the war, the story of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion was mostly forgotten. History books focused on infantry divisions, airborne units, tank battalions. Barrage balloon units received little attention. The fact that the 320th was African American made them even less visible in historical accounts. The 1950s and 60s brought civil rights struggles. African American veterans fought for recognition, for equality, for the respect they deserved. Some made progress, many did not. Woodson watched from Philadelphia, worked, raised his family, did not seek attention. In 1994, a journalist interviewed Woodson about D-Day. The interview was part of the 50th anniversary coverage. Woodson was 70 years old. He described his experience for the first time publicly, talked about the landing craft explosion, the casualties, the drowning soldiers, the 30 hours of work while wounded. The journalist was shocked, asked why Woodson had not received the Medal of Honor. Woodson said it had been downgraded to Distinguished Service Cross. The journalist asked why. Woodson did not answer directly, but the implication was clear. Race had been a factor. The interview was published in several newspapers, but it generated little attention. 50 years had passed. Most people did not care about old war stories. The article was forgotten quickly. In 2001, Congress passed the Code Talkers Recognition Act. The law recognized Native American code talkers who served in World War I and World War II. They received congressional gold medals. Long overdue recognition. The legislation prompted questions about other overlooked minorities. African American veterans, Hispanic veterans, Asian American veterans. All had served with distinction. All had been denied proper recognition during and after the war. In 2005, Woodson died. He was 83 years old, died at home in Philadelphia. Joanne was with him. So were his children. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with military honors, Distinguished Service Cross, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. The medals he earned were displayed at his funeral, but the Medal of Honor was not among them. That omission bothered his family, bothered historians, bothered people who learned his story. The question persisted: why had Woodson been denied the Medal of Honor? In 2015, journalist Linda Herview published a book, Forgotten: The Untold Story of D-Day's Black Heroes, at Home and at War. The book documented the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, described their service, their courage, their treatment during and after the war. The book included extensive coverage of Woodson. Herview had researched his service record, found witness statements, located documents about the Medal of Honor recommendation, discovered that General John Lee's office had recommended upgrading the Distinguished Service Cross to Medal of Honor, but the recommendation had disappeared. The book generated new interest in Woodson's story. Historians examined the evidence, military records, witness statements, medical reports. Everything supported the Medal of Honor. The downgrade appeared unjust, possibly motivated by racial discrimination. In 2018, Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland began advocating for Woodson. Van Hollen wrote to the Secretary of the Army, requested review of Woodson's case, argued that Woodson deserved the Medal of Honor, that the original denial was wrong, that justice required correction. The Army responded cautiously, acknowledged Woodson's story was compelling, but said Medal of Honor recommendations had strict timelines. They had to be submitted within 3 years of the action. Woodson's original recommendation had been submitted in 1944. 74 years had passed, too late for reconsideration. Van Hollen argued the timeline should not apply. Woodson had been denied proper recognition due to discrimination. That injustice should not be permanent. The Army disagreed. Rules were rules, no exceptions. In 2020, Congress introduced legislation to award Woodson the Medal of Honor. The bill had bipartisan support. Republicans and Democrats agreed. Woodson deserved recognition. The legislation moved through committee, appeared headed for passage, but the bill stalled. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted congressional business. The legislation did not receive a vote. It died at the end of the congressional session. Van Hollen promised to reintroduce it, but progress was slow. Joanne Woodson was 95 years old in 2024. She had been fighting for her husband's recognition for 19 years, since his death in 2005. She had written letters, attended meetings, testified before congressional committees, shared her husband's story with anyone who would listen. In May 2024, the Army made an announcement. Waverly Woodson would be posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The announcement confused many people. Woodson had already received the Distinguished Service Cross in 1944. Why was he receiving it again 80 years later? The answer was bureaucratic. The Army had lost the original award documentation. No record existed of the 1944 ceremony. Therefore, officially, Woodson had never received the medal. The Army was correcting the record, presenting the medal his family should have had all along. The ceremony was scheduled for June 7, 2024, the 80th anniversary of Woodson's evacuation from Omaha Beach. The ceremony would take place at the Pentagon. Joanne would receive the medal on her husband's behalf, but for historians and advocates, the Distinguished Service Cross was not enough. Woodson deserved the Medal of Honor. The fight would continue. The injustice would not stand. And on June 7, 2024, when Joanne Woodson accepted her husband's Distinguished Service Cross at the Pentagon, she made clear that the family would never stop fighting for the recognition Waverly Woodson earned 80 years earlier on the bloodiest beach in American military history. On June 7, 2024, United States Army soldiers from the 1st Army conducted a ceremony on Omaha Beach in France. 80 years after D-Day, the ceremony honored Corporal Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. The soldiers placed his Distinguished Service Cross medal on the sand at the exact spot where Woodson had come ashore on June 6, 1944. Major General William Ryan led the ceremony. He explained the significance. Woodson had saved lives on this beach, had worked 30 hours while wounded, had treated 200 casualties, had earned recognition that was denied for decades. This ceremony was overdue, long overdue. The medal lay on the sand for several minutes. Soldiers stood in silence. The beach was peaceful now. Tourists walked along the shore. Children played in the surf. No machine gun fire, no artillery, no bodies, just sand and water and sky. Staff Sergeant Aaron Williams attended the ceremony. He was African American, serving in the modern Army. He spoke about what the ceremony meant, said understanding Woodson's experience was very touching, said being at the exact spot was historic, said Woodson's story mattered. The medal was then carefully packaged, sent to the United States, would be presented to Joanne Woodson at the Pentagon. She was 95 years old, had been fighting for her husband's recognition since 2005, would finally receive official acknowledgement of his service on September 24, 2024. The Pentagon ceremony took place. Joanne Woodson sat in the front row, surrounded by family. 3 generations, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, all present to witness recognition their patriarch deserved. Secretary of the Army Christine Warmuth presented the Distinguished Service Cross, read the citation aloud, described Woodson's actions on Omaha Beach, his treatment of casualties under fire, his rescue of drowning soldiers, his 30 hours of continuous service while seriously wounded, his refusal to stop despite infection and fever. The citation was detailed, specific, listed the number of casualties treated, 200 soldiers, listed the rescues, 3 men saved from drowning, listed the procedures performed, amputations, chest wound treatments, fracture settings, all done under enemy fire with minimal supplies. Joanne accepted the medal, held it carefully, looked at the ribbon, the bronze cross, the inscription. She was crying. Family members stood and applauded. The room joined them. 2 minutes of sustained applause for a hero who had been overlooked for 80 years. Senator Chris Van Hollen spoke at the ceremony, said Woodson was a hero who saved dozens, if not hundreds, of troops, said the only thing that stood between him and proper recognition was the color of his skin, said this was an opportunity to right a historic wrong, said the fight for the Medal of Honor would continue. Steve Woodson spoke, Waverly's son. He was 66 years old, fought back tears, said it had been a long road to reach this day, said his father would have been humbled, said the recognition mattered to the entire family, said they would never forget what their father had done. But the Distinguished Service Cross was not the Medal of Honor. That fact remained. The injustice remained. The question remained. Why had Woodson been denied the highest recognition? The evidence was overwhelming. Witness statements from dozens of soldiers, medical reports documenting his wounds, service records showing 29 hours of continuous work, documentation of 200 casualties treated, 3 drowning rescues, multiple life-saving procedures, all performed while seriously wounded and under constant enemy fire. The criteria for Medal of Honor were clear: conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Woodson met every requirement, multiple times over. Yet he received Distinguished Service Cross, second highest decoration, not the highest. The statistical pattern was undeniable. During World War II, 433 Medals of Honor were awarded. 0 went to African Americans. None. Despite over 1 million Black Americans serving in the military, despite countless documented acts of extraordinary valor. In 1997, the Army commissioned a study, examined whether black troops had been unjustly overlooked. The study found systemic discrimination, recommended 7 African American soldiers for upgrade to Medal of Honor. All 7 received the medal. President Bill Clinton presented them in a White House ceremony. Waverly Woodson was considered during that study, was interviewed by researchers, provided documentation, described his actions, but he was not among the 7 selected. No explanation was given. The decision was final. The timeline argument persisted. Medal of Honor recommendations required submission within 3 years of the action. Woodson's had been submitted in 1944, but it had been downgraded, not rejected, downgraded. That should have allowed reconsideration. But the Army maintained its position. Too late. Rules were rules. Advocates disagreed, argued the rules should not protect injustice, should not perpetuate discrimination, should not deny recognition earned through extraordinary courage. The fight continued. In 2024, multiple organizations supported Woodson's Medal of Honor. The NAACP, Veterans of Foreign Wars, American Legion, Congressional Black Caucus, all agreed. Woodson deserved the highest recognition. All pushed for congressional action. New legislation was drafted. Would award Woodson the Medal of Honor by act of Congress, bypassing the timeline restriction, correcting the historic wrong. The legislation had bipartisan sponsors, strong support in both chambers, appeared headed for passage. But as of late 2024, the legislation had not been voted on. Still in committee, still under review, still delayed. Joanne Woodson was 95 years old. Time was running out. The recognition needed to come soon, or it would come too late. Woodson's story influenced modern military medicine. His methods on Omaha Beach became case studies. Medical training emphasized his approach: triage under fire, resource management, continuous operation despite personal injury. These lessons were taught at combat medic schools. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion received recognition decades after the war. In 2003, a memorial plaque was installed at the American Cemetery in Normandy, honored the battalion's service, acknowledged they were the first African American combat unit on Omaha Beach. In 2019, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture created an exhibit, featured the 320th, included photographs, equipment, personal stories. Woodson's story was prominently displayed. Visitors learned about the forgotten heroes of D-Day. But recognition in museums was not enough. Recognition through plaques was not enough. Woodson deserved the Medal of Honor. His family deserved closure. History deserved truth. The facts were simple. On June 6th and 7th, 1944, Corporal Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. performed acts of extraordinary valor on Omaha Beach, worked 30 hours while seriously wounded, treated 200 casualties, saved 3 men from drowning, performed battlefield surgery with minimal equipment, risked his life repeatedly under constant enemy fire, met every criterion for the Medal of Honor, was denied because of the color of his skin. That injustice stands today, 80 years later. The wrong has not been fully corrected. The fight continues. And until Waverly Woodson receives the Medal of Honor he earned on the bloodiest beach in American military history, the story is not finished. If this story moved you, do something right now. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this forgotten hero to more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We rescue stories like Waverly's from silence every single day. Real heroes, real sacrifice. Stories that deserve to be remembered. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, France. Our community spans the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching this story about Corporal Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. Thank you for making sure he is not forgotten. Thank you for being part of the fight for justice. These heroes deserve better, and you're helping make that happen.